Well, I have the good fortune of having on the phone with us at this time Luke Messer. He's currently the congressman of Indiana's 6th District, and he is one of 3 Republicans running for the Republican nomination for the U.S. Senate in the state of Indiana. And so I've invited him on along with the other candidates to explain to us really why we should consider voting for them on May 8th. So, Luke, it's a pleasure having you here. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Oh, great to be on, Todd. Good morning.
Okay, so this campaign, again, I watch it from a distance, as do our listeners. It appears to be a campaign. Trump has, I think, an impact on this campaign as far as the issues, or a lot of folks are trying to align to be the most pro-Trump candidate, it appears to me anyway. I guess tell our listeners, what role you think Trump or some of the things Trump is trying to do in this election, issue-wise, have on the 2018 campaign here in the state of Indiana.
Well, I mean, first, it's great to be on with your listeners, and I look forward to having a conversation here. I do think President Trump is he is the sun and the moon on the Indiana Republican landscape right now, and so it's important. I think most voters that I talk to want to know which candidate's going to be the best Trump ally, who's going to not just talk a good game about supporting President Trump, but who's really going to be there when it comes time for the hard votes that it takes to help President Trump govern. There's been a whole lot of talk in this campaign about who was with President Trump in a particular campaign or something someone may have said on TV. I can tell you what most people I talk to want to know is, are you with this president on his policies? Are you working with him when it comes to the substantive work he's trying to do to help working families all across Indiana and all across our country? And I am. That's what I've spent the last year and a half doing. Look, I grew up in a working family. My mom was a single parent mother who retired recently from the Delta Faucet factory in Greensburg. And she really is an example of the kind of forgotten men and women all across this country, working people that make this country work, that have been left behind by the policies of the last couple of decades. I think that's what fueled the election of President Trump. And in this campaign, and I mean, we'll probably talk about this difference several times throughout our conversation today, but you've got 2 people who are like me running around and, expressing support for President Trump. I think there's real questions when you look at their record. I mean, one guy, Mike Braun, is a 38-year, he voted 38 years in Democrat primaries and yet says he was a lifetime Republican. As I asked in the debate that we just most recently had, who else do you know who is a lifetime Republican who voted 38 straight years in Democrat primaries? It just doesn't make sense. I think Mike owes Hoosiers a better explanation. And Todd Rokita, who, has voted with President Trump on a number of things, but has not been there for President Trump on the hard votes it takes to govern, funding for our troops, the beginning of funding for our border. And then he was recently admonished by the Trump campaign for misrepresenting support of the president. He was asked to take down his yard signs and change some other advertisements because the Trump campaign thought they were deceptive. And so I know it's hard. When I travel the state, my sense is voters are really trying to figure this out. And, we've got a week yet to help persuade them.
So I know that I saw this in the news recently. In fact, we talked about this on the show earlier today, but this whole issue about Trump getting nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. I see that your name's involved in this. This is fascinating to me, right? I mean, we've had years of America leading from behind, as Obama put it. We've had years of just terrible policies and not dealing with things from a position of strength. We've been, signing pieces of paper and making pinky promises with dictators and thinking that prevents a nuclear holocaust, right? So explain to us, I saw this and I found it interesting. You're kind of involved in this Trump Nobel Peace Prize story.
I'm actually leading the effort. I mean, I've been saying this now for 2 months, that if North Korea actually disarms their nuclear program, President Trump deserves a Nobel Peace Prize. And here's why. Because the only reason the evil dictator from North Korea is coming to the table and trying to make peace is because he realizes there's a new sheriff in town. President Trump has stared him down and shown him that America is strong again. And so, it's fascinating. It's not just me. I mean, yesterday the South Korean leader was saying that President Trump should be considered for the Nobel Peace Prize. The Australian leader has now said it. President Trump was in Michigan, and the crowd was chanting, Nobel, Nobel, Nobel. And I think it's very serious. Look, I'm not naive here. I mean, one, there's a long way to go between now and peace, but the events of the last few days have been extraordinary. I mean, there's not been moments where the North Korean and South Korean leaders have been embracing in 70 years. So the only reason it's happening is that this president understands that America is safest and the world is safest when America is strong. And who knows? I mean, I'm not naive to the Nobel Peace Committee is not exactly a bastion of conservatives, So whether they're willing to give this consideration a fair shake is something else. But we're going to offer a nomination of that. I'm working with my congressional colleagues to make that happen. And what the heck, if President Obama can get a Nobel Peace Prize for basically running a glamorous campaign for president, surely when President Trump achieves this kind of major foreign policy achievement that, again, could bring extraordinary results. If North Korea denuclearizes, it will be a very big deal.
Sure. And I said on the show today that the far left values rhetoric a lot more than they value results. And that is, I think, on display here for all the world to see. Conservative values, strong leadership, peace through strength, that old Reagan mantra, work every time that they're tried. So we need to see more of this on display in Washington, D.C. So I guess tell the voters, because I think there's a battle in the campaign right now, folks trying to, I guess, articulate and demonstrate ways that they are conservative or way that they support the sorts of policies that they've seen Trump trying to implement in Washington, D.C. How do we know, or what are some things you can tell us about you that can demonstrate to us and our audience here that you are, in fact, a conservative, that you are, in fact, someone that's going to be standing up for these conservative principles and not just vote the right way, Luke? And I don't mean this in any disrespectful way to anyone, but I think our listeners want to see someone carrying the mantle of conservatism, not just pressing the right button or saying the right ayes and nays, but actually persuading, moving the needle for conservatism. How does a senator, if you were to win the nomination and beat Donnelly, how does Senator Luke Messiter do this?
Well, Todd, I think that's exactly right, and I think it's a combination of some things. First, look at what our actual life experience is. Look, I grew up in a single-parent family. My mom recently retired from the factory. My other guys I'm running against basically grew up with silver spoons in their mouth. I understand the challenges of working people because I've lived them, and I've had to fight my way up in my life just the way most of your listeners are trying to make their life work as well. Beyond that, you're right. I mean, listen, I have no real reason to believe the other guys running aren't pro-life or they're not pro-Second Amendment, that they more or less won't vote with the president. But who has been willing to actually step out there on the limb and lead? Look, I was one of very few Republicans saying 3 or 4 years ago that we had to respond when Syria dropped chemical weapons on their people, because our enemies and our allies are watching. President Obama was weak, and the world's less safe because of it. President Trump has been strong, and the world is more safe because of it. We just talked about the fact that when no one else was talking about the president potentially receiving a Nobel Peace Prize, I was out leading the effort, and now I'm leading the effort to make him nominated. I know it may be difficult to get him to win, but I think it's an important statement, as you say, that peace through strength works, and that, if a leader uses tough language and that leads to peace, then we ought to be acknowledging that that is an important step towards making the world safer. I was one of the very first people to say, actually just days before President Trump was even sworn in, that we already have the authority to build the wall President Trump campaigned on, and that Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and Chuck Schumer actually voted for us to build the wall. They just haven't voted to fund it. And I got a lot of heat on CNN and all these other places because of it. And I do think you're right, Todd, that that's one of the things that voters have to ask themselves. Listen, it's not enough to just spew the talking points. That doesn't really lead anybody. Who has the courage to actually stand there and drive our message and help this president? Most recently, I mean, when the president asked me to support funding for our troops and the beginning of funding for our wall, I knew there would be some political controversy, but this president is under withering criticism every day.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sorry, I'm just not going to be a part of folks that are throwing stones at the president. And so I have stood up for this president against critics on the left and the right. We have big challenges before us as a nation. It's going to take serious leadership to get us there. And, what gives me great optimism in this campaign is I just have this sense, I just trust the people of Indiana that, your listeners are going to get a chance to hear all three of us talk. I think they have a chance to decipher through and figure out who is sincerely believes in the conservative principles that we all support, and then who's actually going to lead on them.
Two quick questions here before I'm going to stop and take a break, and then we'll resume this after the timeout. But you bring up Syria. I'm wondering, from your perspective, does the way that we responded in Syria have an impact on what is happening on the Korean Peninsula right now with North Korea and South Korea talking? What does that demonstrate to Kim Jong-un that he's messing with a new type of leader that's not afraid to intervene in ways that we wouldn't have considered in the past? Not saying that that's the path we're going down, but does that have an impact on this whole North Korean negotiation that we see taking place right now?
Absolutely. America is safest and the world is safest when America is strong. When we don't keep our promises, when we don't keep our commitments, when we don't show strength, dictators all over the world are watching. Not just North Korea, Iran, Russia, in China. You've seen, I would argue, even our allies. Look, some of what Israel has had to do in Gaza over the last several years has been a response to the fact that under President Obama's leadership, they didn't know we would have their back. Look, there is no question that President Trump's strength in Syria is part of the recipe that brought North Korea to the table. I think it's part of what's bringing China to the table in those same negotiations. I think Russia now is beginning to learn and understand that this president will stare you down. And I think Iran understands that Iran nuclear deal, which was a bad deal for the people of Israel, a bad deal for America, and made the world less safe, may be President Trump's next big step forward. So, yes, President Trump's demonstration of strength is bringing major dividends for America around the world.
One more question here before we take a quick timeout. This omnibus bill, you correct me if I'm wrong, you supported the president's, or this what's referred to as the omnibus budget or whatever, the spending bill that takes us through September or whenever, and that's something that Rokita opposed. So this is one area that you guys are on different sides of the vote, as I understand it. I guess explain your position on that, why you took that vote.
Listen, I understand that vote has some controversy, and I understand that many conservatives were critical. I would just ask your listeners to remember this. When the commander-in-chief comes to you and says, we have men and women dying in our military because they don't have the equipment and training that they need. Our Army is the smallest it's been since World War II. Our Navy, the smallest it's been since World War I. Our Air Force, the smallest that it's been in modern lifetime. That in the Navy, a third of their airplanes don't fly, and they are harvesting parts out of museums to try to service these planes. I frankly just think it's immoral to not stand with your commander-in-chief when that's what he asks you to do. Listen, I understand the politics of that may be difficult, but I'm in the middle of a campaign, and I still have to be able to look in the mirror regardless of what happens. And so I want your listeners to know this. When I go around the state and say I support our troops and I support President Trump, I'm not going to go to Washington and then just vote some other way because the politics of it get inconvenient. I'm going to stand with our president. I'm going to stand with our troops, and I'm going to vote the hard votes it takes to help this president lead.
Okay, fair enough. Well, Luke, if you can sit with me through this break, we'll come back and continue this interview. Can you do that?
Yeah, of course. Yep.
Perfect. So we're going to take a quick break. You are listening to the home of conservative, not bitter talk radio. Be back in just a minute. I have on the phone Luke Messer. He is the current 6th District Congressman for the state of Indiana, and he is running for the Republican nomination for Senate here in the state of Indiana, which is a very important race. And we've been talking about some of the issues and positions and so forth concerning this campaign. And this campaign has gotten, I don't know, depending upon your viewpoint, at least a little tense, maybe a little nasty. How would you characterize where things are currently in this campaign, Luke?
Todd, I was taught by my mom to worry about yourself and your own conduct. And I can tell you in my campaign, I've stayed laser focused on Joe Donnelly. After all, that's really what we're trying to do here, nominate a Republican that will beat Joe Donnelly. Joe Donnelly's not who he says he is. He talks conservative back home in Indiana, and then he votes with his party's liberal leadership 85% of the time. And I've just talked about facts with a couple of my opponents. I mean, it is a fact that Mike Braun is a lifetime Democrat who voted in Democratic primaries for 38 years. As I've asked voters around the state, who else do you know who calls themselves a lifetime Republican even though they voted in Democrat primaries for 38 years? It doesn't ring true, and if he's not telling the truth about that, what else has he not done? How can we trust him to stand with President Trump? And, you know, it's a fact that Todd Rokita has been deemed by independent fact checkers to be running one of the most negative campaigns and it's been deemed mostly false. It's a fact that President Trump's campaign had to ask Todd Rokita to pull down advertisements because he was misrepresenting the president's support. And so that's where we've stayed focused, is the facts. I welcome the opportunity. You mentioned that we would talk about some of the attacks that have been thrown at me, and I'm glad to respond to them.
Sure, and that's what I'm going to ask you now. I've seen some questions pertaining to your residency, whether you actually live in the state, where home is, and again, these attacks can come from a variety of places, but I guess address that, because obviously it's important to Hoosiers that there's a connection, that you're part of the community and the fabric of the state. So I guess address that accusation that's been made that you don't live in the state.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I'm a lifetime Hoosier with a home in Greensburg, Indiana that I've owned for 17 years. What most of this has been about is, where do my kids go to school? And the reality is my kids are with me as I serve in Washington, because my kids need a full-time dad. Faith and family come first for me in my life. And when I first got elected to Congress, Mike Pence and Karen Pence counseled our family that the best way to look out for our country, to serve our country, and look out for your family is to stay together. So that's what we did. What we've done, and the way we conduct our family is the same way Mike Pence did, the same way Dan Coates did, Dan Quayle did, and a whole lot of other pro-family conservatives over the last several decades. As I talk to people around the state, they're actually proud to hear of an elected leader who not only talks about family values, but actually lives them. And the only time I even hear about this question is when I'm being attacked by one of the other candidates who are trying to exploit it for their own political gain.
So what do you say when folks, of course, in this political environment, especially I think in the heartland like we have here in the Hoosier State, this being associated as being part of the swamp is not a good thing, a term that was coined by Trump. So there's some people that are trying to position you as being part of the swamp, part of that overarching problem that we're facing with this growing government and so forth. What do you say to that?
I can tell you that I go home and I have dinner with my kids. I teach Sunday school. I was named the 4th grade and 5th grade basketball coach of the year in my son's basketball leagues. I coach flag football. I get to go to my kids' band concerts because we're together, right? And I'm home all the time in Indiana because it's important that we serve. And the home I own is a home I own with my mother, because she was a single parent mother. She never owned a house her entire life. And so 17 years ago, I bought one for her, and I stay with her now and live with her now so that she can afford to still have a home. And, I think all of those truths are just like, it's a world that Hoosiers can relate to. So I think it's important to stay connected to the state. I am. I've spent my whole life here, and I think it's important to stay connected to your family, and I think most Hoosiers understand that.
And what about the argument that don't send Luke Messer to Washington? He's just going to vote to raise taxes as he has voted to raise taxes in the past. What do you say to that?
It's just more Todd Rokita crazy talk. I mean, listen, again, independent fact checkers have said Todd's campaign is mostly false. I mean, every Indiana Republican knows that Mitch Daniels balanced budgets without raising taxes. I was standing alongside of him as one of his lead lieutenants as we got that done. And I remember Todd Rokita praising Mitch Daniels when Todd was serving as Secretary of State. The only reason why he's making those kind of false accusations now is because somehow he thinks it's going to help him in a campaign. But I think he's wrong. And Hoosiers are seeing through his negativity. And in the end, it's really all of Todd's unfair, false, negative attacks are really starting to hurt him.
So let's say let's assume you win the primary here, which is just a week away now. Let's assume you win the primary. You are the Republican candidate for senator in the state of Indiana. You face Joe Donnelly in a head-to-head battle. I've not seen a lot of polls, but I've seen right now Joe Donnelly still polls pretty well in the things that I've seen, and maybe you have internals that are contrary to that. I candidly hope so, to be quite honest with you. But how does Luke Messer defeat Joe Donnelly, who, again, as you stated earlier, which I think spot on correct, as someone who wants to portray himself as bipartisan, as a moderate? This guy votes with the far extreme leftists in the U.S. Senate today, the Bernie Sanders, the Elizabeth Warrens, and so forth. How do you defeat this guy here and win this Senate seat back for Republicans?
Well, quick point on polling, Todd, which is that Joe Donnelly's trailing a generic Republican in polling that's been released publicly. And of all the candidates in the race, I'm the person that's polling closest to him when it comes to trying to beat him. But polls aren't the way we beat Joe Donnelly. How we beat Joe Donnelly is by staying focused on the truth. As I said earlier, Joe Donnelly says he's conservative when he's back home in Indiana, but the reality is he votes with liberal Democratic leadership most of the time out in Washington. That's out of step with Hoosiers. We're going to beat Joe Donnelly with the truth. And as I've said throughout this campaign, I am who I say I am. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm a son of a single-parent mother. I'm a person of faith who is a pro-life, pro-Second Amendment conservative. And I support President Trump. And I've got a record to prove it. Our biggest risk in the next week as we nominate who we nominate is if we nominate someone who isn't who they say they are. And for the reasons I've talked about before, Mike Braun is not who he says he is. He's pretending to be a conservative Republican when almost his entire adult life he's been a Democrat. A lifetime Democrat doesn't become a conservative Republican overnight. And Todd Rokita has run what is considered one of the most dishonest campaigns in the history of the state. Independent fact checkers have said his campaign's mostly false. And he even had to go through the extraordinary step of having the Trump campaign tell him to take down his advertisements because he was misrepresenting the president's support. We're going to beat Joe Donnelly with the truth. And I'm the true conservative in this race. I am who I say I am. You may agree with me on some issues and disagree with me on others, but I will always tell the truth. And that's what it's going to take to beat Joe Donnelly.
So let's say that all that comes true. You win the nomination. You beat Donnelly in a head-to-head, in the general election in November. And let's say day one, you walk into Washington, D.C., Senator Luke Messer. What is on your agenda? What are the first things, or the first couple of issues or things that you want to tackle, address as Senator Luke Messer?
The first thing is frozen paychecks in the middle of the economy. I think that is what elected President Trump. Working people across this country have seen their wages flatline over the last couple of decades in real dollars, and they feel like all of their leaders in Washington are leaving them behind. So I think a lot of what we need to do is support President Trump's policies. We need to cut taxes. We do need to end Obamacare to help on healthcare costs. We need to have trade deals that are free but fair. And we need to support the president in the efforts it takes to make sure we start to see wages grow in this economy again. Thankfully, you're seeing some of that over the course of the past year. Second, America is safest when America is strong. And so we've got to stay focused on building our military and on helping President Trump as he brings peace through strength. And third, we've got to reform the Senate. Listen, we've got two major problems in the United States Senate. The Senate is broken. Joe Donnelly's part of that problem. But we need a conservative majority in the Senate. We already have a Republican one, but we're not getting many of the president's biggest agenda items passed because some Republicans aren't keeping their promises. And then we need to end the filibuster, because whatever that rule used to be, the rule that requires a supermajority to pass substantive legislation in the Senate, it has now become a tool of partisan gamesmanship that puts Chuck Schumer and the Democrats in charge. And so I'm the only person in this race actually campaigning on that. And I think it's important that we start to drive that reform.
What about the Iran deal? What do you do as a senator? What do you think about that? Because the Senate's the one that messed this up, the way that they handled this whole issue with the Iran deal.
Absolutely.
And Joe Donnelly, this to me is something that needs to be maybe in the general folks need to be reminded of. But he's part of this. He's part of the folks that allowed us to head down the same path that we had headed down with Bill Clinton and the North Koreans back in the 90s. This is almost an exact replay and possibly more dangerous because of the amount of craziness that we see coming out of the Iranian regime. But regardless, what do you do about that? What are your thoughts about the Iran deal?
Well, first, Todd, your analysis is absolutely spot on. The Iran deal was a terrible deal from the beginning. It gave billions of dollars to the Iranian regime that they're using to fund terrorism. I applaud President Trump's posture so far, and I believe he will take further steps to try to reverse the Iran nuclear deal to make sure that if we have a deal, it's a deal that actually keeps Iran from having nukes. I mean, part of the problem with the deal that was just passed is not only did we fuel this evil Iranian regime, but we left them on a path that 10 years from now, when the deal comes to its conclusion, they'll be closer to nuclear weapons than they were when they started. That is an unacceptable outcome. You're right, Joe Donnelly. This is another example of where Joe Donnelly tries to have it both ways. He comes home and he says he's conservative. He says he stands for America. He says he stands for our partnership with Israel. And then he signs off when his party leadership pushes him hard on this terrible Iran nuclear deal because Barack Obama asked him to do it. The deal left America less safe. It left our ally in that region, Israel, less safe. And it made the world less safe because, as you described, Todd, we have already seen this play before. I mean, this is exactly what happened during the Clinton years with North Korea. And in many ways, because I had a meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu once in Israel, and Benjamin Netanyahu made the point that history remembers the big things. And Iran having nuclear weapons would be an extraordinary event, because unlike most folks that have had nuclear weapons in the past, Iran is full of religious zealots who believe that they will somehow die. They will go to heaven for dying a glorious death in war. So they are zealots, and you cannot allow them to have the kind of weapons of mass destruction that could endanger literally millions and millions and millions of people.
Absolutely. They're led by jihadists. That's what they are. In fact, we have a parody. It's a parody. It's satire. It's exaggeration and so forth. But there's a truth in here. We have a parody song, Jihadi Joe, about Joe Donnelly helping to put all this stuff into motion. And it is dangerous. You're exactly right. So I want to be respectful.
And Todd, let me ask this one point. Let me maybe add this point too. I can't, of course, divulge classified information, but I can tell you this, that our best information on Iran's leaders is they say the same kinds of crazy things to each other privately that they say publicly. In other words, it appears they actually believe the jihadist nonsense that they spew publicly, and that is very frightening.
Well, I want to be very respectful of your time. I know you have a lot of things to do here, especially since we're in the final week of the campaign. So just in closing with our listeners, let's say, just when they go to the polls on May 8th or, if they're early voting between now and then, why should they press the button for Luke Messer when they make that decision?
Thanks for asking that question, Todd, and thank you for giving me this time. Listen, as I travel the state, it just seems to me that voters are really trying to figure this out. They're earnestly pouring through all of these ads, and they want to know who's the right person for them. I would just, again, tell your listeners this. I'm Luke Messer, and I am who I say I am. I'm a pro-life, pro-Second Amendment conservative who supports President Trump. I support him against attacks from liberals in the media, and I support him from attacks on critics in both parties. I grew up the life of a working Hoosier. That is exactly who my life is. And we're going to beat Joe Donnelly by telling the truth. The truth is Joe Donnelly's not a conservative. He votes with his party's liberal leadership. And we need a real conservative, not somebody who spent their whole lifetime as a Democrat and is now trying to buy a Senate race, not somebody who's memorized the talking points and frankly is willing to say almost anything about the people that he's running against so that he can somehow con his way through a primary election. We're going to beat Joe Donnelly with a fighter, that's me, who tells the truth like I have. And I would ask everybody that's listening today for their vote.
Well, very good. Luke, I appreciate your time very much. We will be watching this very closely. I think it's a very important election, a primary election. And again, thank you very much for your time.
Hey, Todd, great to be on.
Again, this is Luke Messer joining us. He's running for Indiana's nomination for the Republican Party to the U.S. Senate. The primary is here on May 8th, so lots of decisions for folks here in this audience to make here in the next week. But you are listening to the home of conservative, not bitter talk radio. Be back in just a minute.